today's session.
Yes.
So welcome to Neighboring 101, where we talk to people from all over the United States that are working in the neighboring space and discovering ways that being connected with our neighbors and in our neighborhood can improve our communities and our life. And March has been a theme for Mr. Rogers here in Springfield, Missouri. It's been Won't You Be My Neighbor week all week with a local television station. And the library district tells me there's a long waiting list for the Mr. Rogers effect at the local library now. But I know some of you have also gotten a copy of the book and have read it yourself, as I have. So, very excited to be able to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Anita Knight. She is a professor of psychology and counseling at Liberty University, and she's also the author of The Mr. Rogers Effect. Anita, thank you for taking time to join us from Virginia, right? And to share with us. I think she has a PowerPoint to go along today, too, but we're very excited to get to discuss this work and discuss a little bit about what we can learn from Mr. Rogers.
Thank you so much for that gracious introduction, David. I really appreciate it. I'm so happy to be here with you all. And I loved hearing about Megan's story and how she's spreading the Mr. Rogers effect in her neighborhood. And love the cardigans and the sweaters and the cozy vibes that you guys are portraying today. I think Mr. Rogers would be pleased. So I'll try to share my screen with you to share this PowerPoint. Let's see.
There you go. See, you are obviously more tech savvy than I am. That happened so easily for you. Great job.
Thanks for preparing the way on that. I appreciate it. Can you guys see my screen all right? Excellent. Okay, thank you. Well, hi neighbors. I just wanted to share with you a little background on the Mr. Rogers effect and how it came to be. I work as a counseling professor and psychology professor in the School of Behavioral Sciences at a university. So I train counselors, and I was in the classroom once and I showed the class a clip similar to what David did with us today that showed Mr. Rogers advocating to save public television. Have you guys happened to have seen that clip before? Okay, some of you are nodding. If you haven't, there was a time when PBS was on the chopping block, and Mr. Rogers went before the Senate and talked with Senator Pastore, who is a self-proclaimed pretty tough guy. He called, that's what he called himself. He's sort of this curmudgeonly attitude that he portrayed. And he was in a bit of an irritable mood. But when Mr. Rogers approached him, he stayed very cool, calm, and collected, and he didn't let that derail him at all. And he began to share with Senator Pastore about the program and about trust and how he trusted that Pastore would read the statement that he had prepared. And Senator Pastore, in a bit of a gruff voice, said, "Would it make you happy if you read it?" And Mr. Rogers just stayed calm. He said, "No, that's okay. I'd just like to talk about it if it's all right with you." So Senator Pastore invited him to go ahead, and he picked up on the anger that Pastore was feeling. And then towards the end of his talk, he shared the lyrics to a song, a very touching song, similar to the one we just listened to in that introductory clip. But it was called "What Do You Do with the Mad That You Feel?" When you feel so mad you could bite, the whole wide world feels oh so wrong. Nothing you do feels very right. Do you round up friends for a game of tag and see how fast you can go? And towards the end of the song, it says, "Good to be able to stop." And actually, this was on Megan's quote that she shared with her Mr. Rogers figurine. But it's good to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and do something else instead, and think this song. And Senator Pastore said, "I think it's wonderful. You just earned the $20 million. And that's the day he was credited with saving public television. But what I wanted my students to look at a little bit was the way he was able to pick up on Pastore's anger and connect with him and connect with the inner child inside of him, and be able to sort of transform him from adversary to ally in just a matter of minutes. by helping validate his feelings and emotions, which is similar to what counselors do. They work with people on validating emotions. And I asked my students, what was it like for you to watch this clip and see Mr. Rogers do this? And one of my students raised her hand and she shared, I work in the inner city schools and my kids don't have a Mr. Rogers. So she said they just turned to violence, they beat each other up, they hurt each other, and it's a problem. And that just stuck with me, and I continued to think about that and think about um, the work of Mr. Rogers. And even though he died 21 years ago now, and at that time it was almost 20 years ago, I thought there's no reason that all the incredible work that he did uh, needs to uh, die as well. We can keep that effect that he had alive in our own neighborhoods. And it was my hope, of course, that students that are training to become counselors and school counselors would be able to bring that neighborly spirit and sense of security and safety and so many of the things that Mr. Rogers taught into their own counseling offices and school systems. And so I got together with a panel of experts from the school behavioral sciences, as well as psychiatrists, clinical mental health counselors, school counselors, all part of the panel, and analyzed Mr. Rogers' programming and his writing. He's written several books and even books that a journalist wrote about him. He was famous for making friends with journalists and flipping the interview and finding out more about them sometimes than they would about him. And you guys may have any of you seen the Tom Hanks movie? Uh, Turned out to be a lot of the movie about the journalist, one of the journalists that he befriended. I think it was kind of a conglomeration of two different stories because there was multiple journalists that he befriended, um, but interesting story there. Anyway, the panel analyzed all these different things, and we had to come to full consensus and agreement on the top 7 strategies he used to make a difference and have an impact, so that now more than 20 years after he's gone, he's still nourishing our souls. He's still influencing us for good. And so we looked at those 7 psychological strategies, what they were, and how we could implement them in our own neighborhood. And I know we only have a short time here together today, so I thought I'd pick up with 3 of those and unpack those and what they might look like for us. And then maybe we'll have some time for Q&A, and I'll share my contact information in case anyone wants to get in touch as well. Um, so these I think we covered most of this, but um, just like Mr. Rogers used to always change into his cardigan sweater at the beginning of every program. And you guys may have remembered this cover of the DVD for Won't You Be My Neighbor, which, by the way, is an amazing documentary. If you haven't had a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. But I like to say to my students, and when I'm starting YouTube videos, let's roll up our sleeves and get started, because that transitional signal that he used every time he walked into his television home, as many of you may remember, taking off his blazer, putting on his cardigan sweater and singing, "Won't you be my neighbor? Would you be mine? Could you be mine?" We could have a sense of anticipation as children to know what was coming, and that helped foster that sense of security and safety. Um, so let's roll up our sleeves and explore this first of the 7. The publishers call them the 7 secrets to bringing out the best in yourself and others from America's beloved neighbor. I guess they thought secrets sounded a little bit more exciting than strategies, but either way, so the similar idea. But one of the quotes that Mr. Rogers used to carry around in his planner, and his wife said he referred to it often, is this quote that there isn't anyone you couldn't love once you've heard their story. And he believed that what was essential was invisible to the eye. And he also had a quote up in his office to remind him to look for the invisible essentials. And that was a quote from a children's book called The Little Prince that he studied in the original French language. And he kept that with him. And we'll talk more about why that may have been especially important and influential to him as a quote, which, by the way, the psychology behind some of the quotes that resonate with you from an Adlerian psychology perspective is that oftentimes your favorite quote is the advice, your advice to yourself for your life.
Hmm.
And so that perhaps could have been some advice that he had for himself, to remember that if he just got to know someone's story, if he focused on the insides, he could learn to love just about anyone. Um, so let's explore empathy as one of the three strategies for today. I think empathy is something that we really need more of in our society, and Mr. Rogers was such a model of how to portray empathy. Um, and sometimes empathy is easily confused with sympathy. And the two are similar, but they're very distinct. So, for example, if a friend's pet or a neighbor's pet passes away, the most common response is sympathy. For example, you might say, I'm so sorry for your loss. And we're socialized to show empathy, or excuse me, sympathy. So that is the common response, but it can lead to a decrease in connection. Because if you think about saying, I'm sorry for your loss, your neighbor might reply, thank you, period. And then that becomes the end of the discussion. We appreciate maybe people's concern. We appreciate that message of sympathy, but it doesn't necessarily open up the conversation to further discussion. Empathy, on the other hand, might say something like, um, I know that your dog was such an important part of your family. You had him for over 15 years. It must have been really hard to lose your pet. Help me understand how the family is coping with it and adjusting. And that requires this capacity to be vulnerable ourselves, to tap into perhaps our own sad feelings of loss, and then to connect with the feelings of the other person. Occasionally, sometimes a response is given that doesn't really convey sympathy or empathy. A friend of mine, Scott, told me that when his dad passed away, he was 19 years old. His uncle told him, "Give it 20 years, and you'll hardly be able to remember him." And of course, this was very disheartening to him because he really wanted to remember his father. They did have a good relationship, and it was a great loss to him. So, although his uncle meant well, uh, and he's able to laugh about it now and say, "I don't want to get Alzheimer's," and uh, you know, I want to remember my dad always. But so sympathy can be a helpful response. It's hard to know what to say during those times, and so to say, "I'm sorry for your loss," is a way of conveying care. But an empathic response is just another option that can open up that discussion just a bit more. I remember once some when my memes died, and I always keep her picture with me on my desk here. I don't know if
Oh,
you guys can see that, but
that's nice. Yeah.
thank you. She was 91 years young when she died. She was one of the most loving, neighborly people you'd ever want to meet. Even though she went through great loss and she lost two sons and her husband, um, but she reminded me of Mr. Rogers in many ways with her capacity to see the best in others. So it hit me pretty hard when she died. And when my colleagues responded, some said, I'm sorry for your loss, which I appreciated. But I do remember one colleague said, "Oh, I know you were so close with her. She was almost like a mom to you. That must have been really tough." And I remember how I felt so understood when he said that, that he really seemed to get it, how special that relationship with was. And I had another colleague, and that was Dr. Gary Sibbs, who I've written some books with. And I had another colleague, Dr. Jeannie Brooks, who said, I know that that relationship was so special. If you'd like to grab coffee sometime and just talk about memories about her and what she meant to you and your
Hmm.
relationship, I'd love to do that. And that just meant the world to me that somebody would have that kind of empathy and care and concern. So it's really a way to open up. So in a nutshell, empathy is feeling with. We connect with our own emotion and the emotion that the other person might be feeling, and we have that emotional connection. We feel with them. Sympathy is feeling for. It's expressing our sympathy or our sadness for another person. So even though they're very similar, they're also distinct. So you might be thinking, wow, that takes a lot of energy, emotional energy and vulnerability to tap into my own feelings. It might be unpleasant to connect with another person's feeling. It's a lot easier to say, I'm so sorry for your loss. So why really dig into that empathy? There's a lot of benefits in the research associated with empathy. Um, I know many of you are helping professionals working in your communities to make a difference. Um, and so even though you're not necessarily counselors, one thing we've seen for counselors is that counselors who are higher in empathy tend to have clients with better outcomes, and their clients tend to continue coming back to counseling and not drop out prematurely. Also, it's an effective remedy and safeguard against bullying. So people that are higher in empathy are less likely to engage in bullying behaviors. It's associated with more successful relationships and higher relationship satisfaction. And that's just a few. There's a long long list of benefits. Um, in addition, it can be helpful to start with something that we don't talk about very often, and that is this idea of self-empathy, um, similar to self-compassion. And one technique that counselors use often, that Mr. Rogers used, and that even some hostage negotiators use, is to engage in this process of labeling emotions, to identify the emotion that someone else is feeling, and then say it out loud so they can hear their own emotion out loud and feel heard and understood. Sometimes this involves using some advanced empathy, where you might be indicating an emotion before the speaker has even shared what they're feeling, but perhaps you're picking up on maybe sadness in their voice or excitement in their voice, or their eyes are lighting up, and you're noticing some emotion. Um, but if we can first be able to recognize our own emotion and be compassionate towards ourselves, then we're more likely to be able to extend that empathy towards our neighbors. So the benefits for self-empathy are it's associated with a decreased inclination to see the worst in other people and use that as a strategy to rate the self more favorably. Or in other words, to say, well, at least I'm not as bad as this. Um, it's also associated with the tendency to be more compassionate towards others and to have respect for oneself and an increased likelihood to forgive our own mistakes as actions of a fallible and imperfect human being, as we all are.
Anita, I'm not going to sidetrack you here, but I love the book, but I was so hoping you were going to talk about empathy today because, frankly, that was the part I loved the most. Probably because
Oh,
that's where I had the most work to do. That's why because that's really hard for me, and I love that section of your book. And it's kind of April Walker in chat has mentioned how hard empathy is for her, and at the same time, I won't out the person, but someone in the class sent me a text saying that they are an imp. Uh, Empathy is their deal, and it's exhausting. So here I am wishing I had more empathy. Some others are saying, "Wow, it's tough emotionally, and it can be exhausting if you do." So there's a balance, I guess,
yeah,
or needs to be.
definitely there's a balance. Thank you so much for sharing that, David. I appreciate that. Didn't see that in the chat, but yeah, it's empathy is associated with a lot of positive outcomes, but sometimes we can over empathize, and that can lead to some personal distress. And because we're connecting with our own feelings more, and we're connecting with other people's feelings, and we're feeling with them, that does take emotional energy, and it can be exhausting. I had a colleague who said that he developed this practice whenever he would leave work, and he worked as a counselor. um, he would just, on his drive home, he had a bit of a commute, about 45 minutes, so he would think about his clients, he would think about their struggles, he would think about how to help them, the techniques that might work best. And then when he got home, he would get out of his car, and he would turn around and wave at his car. And he was waving goodbye to his clients as sort of a signal to himself. Okay, I'm transitioning out of this mode of thinking, and I'm going to go be present with my family, and think about them, and be present with them. And that was his way of trying to kind of contain that empathy to a given allocated period of time. Um, and so, it's nice to hear different strategies, because it's a challenge for all of us. And it's helpful to know how people do this. And Mr. Rogers himself had some real clear strategies that helped him to be so present, and do what he did.
Mm.
Um, y- you know, um, I don't have them necessarily in this presentation, but you could definitely read more about him in the book. But just to mention a few, he loved to spend time by the ocean. He and his wife were gifted uh, for a wedding or anniversary gift a house in Nantucket, and so they would go and spend time there. And he would engage in writing. He loved to swim, and so he would swim in the ocean and talk with neighbors, and enjoy a slower pace of life there. So he definitely took time to slow down, and sometimes he would get away for a few days and just pray and read and have his quiet time, and that was very helpful for him as well. um, So these are just some of the benefits of self-empathy, and it can be hard to be empathic towards ourselves. We tend to internalize the voices of our caregivers early in life. And so if you maybe had a parent that was a perfectionist, you may have internalized that voice and may always be kind of challenging yourself to do things better, to do more. You may feel like it's never enough. But if we can extend that kindness to ourselves, that compassion and empathy towards ourselves, we're more likely to be able to extend it towards our neighbors. I work with a research team of faculty and students at the university, and we've been doing some research on self-compassion. It's been very interesting. One of the things we found is that as people's compassion towards themselves goes up, their anxiety and their worries about relationships goes down. So there's that inverse relationship between compassion and relationship anxiety or worries. Another way to say it is that they become more secure in their relationships as they become more compassionate towards themselves. So that's been exciting to see as well. The people of Denmark are onto something very interesting. According to the World Happiness Report, Denmark has been ranked among the top 3 happiest countries of the world for more than 7 years. And what's really interesting about this is empathy is part of their curricula in school. It's considered just as important as subjects like math and science. They call it Klausentide in Danish, for class hour, and they devote an hour of class time to the study of empathy. So you might be wondering, well, what do you do in an empathy class, right? We definitely don't have empathy classes in the US, but early in their educational journey, children learn to enhance their feeling vocabulary and learn specifically feeling words. They learn to recognize emotions and facial expressions and look at what emotion is being conveyed in a given facial expression and set of muscle groupings. And they also learn to accept the feelings without judgment, without judging the feeling, to be able to identify it and accept it for what it communicates. And eventually they transition to this hour-long class time being devoted to students sharing problems that they're dealing with. And the teacher and all the other students rallying around using their empathy and listening skills to help come up with a solution to that problem. And on days when no one has a problem to discuss, they focus on what's known as the Danish secret to warmth and coziness. You guys may have heard about this, an interesting word. It's pronounced hygge. It's spelled Hygge, but it's pronounced hygge, and it's considered the Danish secret to warm and cozy, and the secret to them being able to thrive in their cold environment. They live in a very northern environment. And this term doesn't exactly have a word that it translates well into English, but it can be described as encompassing intentional intimacy, togetherness, and warmth. It's conveyed by some English words like coziness, companionship, and contentment. There's even a Hygge manifesto, and it talks about emphasizing things like warm lighting rather than, overhead lights, lamps, candles, warm beverages like tea, soups, togetherness, sharing of pleasant foods, um, being able to focus on encouraging other people's successes and developments, and inspiring a spirit of cooperation rather than competition, and many other empathic components. And this really helps foster the joyful part of empathy as well. So I just wanted to give you guys a bonus too for taking the time to be here, because I really appreciate you guys investing in being neighborly and being a part of this. And so we actually originally made this as a bonus for people who bought the book. But if you want to email, this was the files were too large, so we're working with a team that's helping us figure out how to share these. But if you email teamkuhnley@gmail.com and just request the Neighboring 101 bonus, we'll send you this feeling flower. And it's a little bit different in counseling. Sometimes we use something called a feeling wheel, but we wanted to encapsulate this idea that we want to help people nurture and grow in their empathy, in their emotional intelligence, and their capacity to be present with their own emotions. And so a lot of the feeling wheels will have the primary emotions in the center, and then some secondary emotions or emotion words around the circle. We thought the flower was just kind of a fun variation of the feeling wheel, and that it helped with visualizing the metaphor of letting us grow in our emotional connection and emotional literacy. And so you can see some of the feeling words. For example, peaceful is one of the core feelings you see there. And then you see words like relief, mellow, trusting, focused, aligned, comfort, calm, relaxed, sentimental, being some of those words that are associated with peaceful. And sometimes clients that we work with as counselors don't always have um, a large emotion vocabulary. They may have grown up in a family that was more focused on cognition and that really de-emphasized emotion. So it may be harder to connect with those emotion words and those feeling words. So this is just one tool to help boost the feeling vocabulary, which is part of this idea of empathy. And it's something that Mr. Rogers learned from his mentor, Dr. Margaret McFarland, who taught him that anything that's human is mentionable and anything that's mentionable is manageable. And he shortened it for television and said feelings are mentionable and manageable.
Nita, what was that email address again? I missed the last part of it.
Oh yeah, thank
At
you.
Gmail. Okay.
Yeah, it's Team Kuhnley. I know it's a kind of a different spelling, Kuhnley at
Yeah.
gmail.com.
All right.
So a couple things to, thanks for asking about that, David, just making
Yeah.
sure everybody got that. And I can try to put that in the chat at the end. But a couple things to remember, feelings are mentionable and manageable. And when we label a feeling and say it out loud and are able to express it, it can make it more manageable, easier to contain. If we're able to identify our own feelings and express them, others are able to connect with us more. We could be more present and more connected in those ways. Um, if we express appreciation for someone being willing to disclose and know how difficult it can be for people to share their internal feelings, this is an expression of empathy. In Mr. Rogers' program, Mr. McFeely, who by the way, he was named Mr. McFeely because Mr. Rogers' grandpa was Fred McFeely, so he named him after his grandpa. But when the speedy delivery man, Mr. McFeely, came in, once he had him bring some memories from his wedding. I can't remember if it was a video or a photograph, and he talked about his wedding. And then Mr. Rogers said, well, some people get divorced. And Mr. McFeely got very uncomfortable. He hurriedly said, oh, yes, yes. And that happens sometimes. And I must go. I must get on with my deliveries. And he quickly wrapped everything up and ran out the door. And, Mr. Rogers took a moment to reflect on that, the fact that he left very quickly and it seemed like he was uncomfortable or didn't like talking about that. And that was okay. And that some people don't like to talk about that. But he was willing to even mention the discomfort and empathize with the discomfort. And so he had these brilliant ways of helping teach empathy through the screen. So he would notice things like that out loud and model having empathy in places that we might not think of. One of the things that I share with my students is to remember your Q-tip. And it's just a helpful word picture for this idea. It represents, it's an acronym, quit taking it personally. Because a lot of times when we're dealing with people and, they may be having a bad day or maybe they're unpleasant or something happens that's off-putting, it can be easy to take it personally and be offended or be hurt. But chances are, it's more about what's going on with that other person and their own journey, their own story. So if we can avoid taking it personally, like Mr. Rogers did with Senator Pastore, we're more likely to be able to connect with them and do something cooperative and helpful. And so one of my readers said he keeps this jar of Q-tips on his desk now because he works in a setting where sometimes people are not very empathic. And so he keeps these Q-tips on his desk. And anytime he gets a chance, he tells his colleagues about Q-tips. And, sometimes you feel like you need one Q-tip. Sometimes you feel like you need a whole box of them, depending on the situation. But it can just be a good reminder. A lot of times things can feel personal, but chances are they're not. So if we can remember not to take things personally, that can help us to be able to go farther in our cooperativeness and connection. One quick story I wanted to share too was the story about feeding the fish. And you guys may have heard this, but Mr. Rogers also had a book of letters. He would get all these Dear Mr. Rogers letters from his television neighbors, as he called us. And one of the things he said is he thought that was people's way of responding to his invitation. Won't you be my neighbors? Children would ask their parents to help them write in letters. And oh, by the way, there was a funny story about one girl who said every time they played the song, Won't You Be My Neighbor, and showed the overview of the television neighborhood, she would stand up and look closely at all the houses to try to find a for sale sign. And there was never a for sale sign in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. So she was so disappointed they couldn't move into the neighborhood. But in one of these letters that Mr. Rogers received was from a little girl named Katie and her father. And Katie was blind and she would listen to the program, and she knew that Mr. Rogers had fish and that he would feed the fish, but sometimes he wouldn't say it out loud. So she would worry that the fish were hungry and were not being fed, and she would cry every time he didn't say out loud that he was feeding the fish. So then from that time on, he said out loud, I'm feeding the fish, every time he was feeding the fish for the rest of his programming. Um, so I just love the way he took her thoughts and her concerns to heart. And even though he might not have been able to tell the story on the air, he did, of course, share it later. But he responded and he cared, and he expressed his concern by narrating when he fed the fish. So empathy requires this capacity to courageously be willing to be vulnerable and connect to a similar feeling in ourselves. Um, so it does require some courage to take a risk and be vulnerable. So anytime we're vulnerable, of course, there's some risk of rejection. And so some people can find it more comforting depending on your attachment style or relationship style, which we'll talk a little bit about later, but it can feel easier to distance from feelings. But in order to connect and be empathic, we actually have to take that step to be vulnerable and connect with those feelings. Which we're not always socialized to do. So that can be a challenge. Okay, so on to the next. Oh, any questions or comments about empathy before we go on to the next secret?
I don't see any hands raised
Okay,
in our Zoom world.
rolling. All right.
Yeah, keep tracking through this one, and then we'll have a little bit of time to maybe ask some general questions at the end.
That sounds good. So the next secret, this one has been described as relationship glue. It's associated with a long list of benefits, lower blood pressure, enhanced immune function, increased acts of helpfulness and generosity, an increase in well-being, an increase in life satisfaction, a decrease in depression, and an increase in social connection. So a lot of benefits associated with this secret. The secret is gratitude. Um, and I know we've heard a lot about gratitude, right? Probably been told by grandma or mom or dad or someone along the journey of becoming, to count your blessings. One of the things that Mr. Rogers said, and one of my favorite quotes from him is this one, and it's an excerpt from a commencement speech. He was often asked to speak at graduation ceremonies. He said, "You see, I believe that appreciation is a holy thing, that when we look for what's best in the person we happen to be with at the moment, we're doing what God does. So in loving and appreciating our neighbor, we're participating in something truly sacred. Thank you for your warm welcome." And I love the way he went on to express appreciation right at the end of that as he was addressing that group. Um, but I like the way that he identified the spiritual spark, that when we really look for what's best in others and try to express that appreciation, um, it's something very special. Gratitude has also been described as relationship miracle grow that helps keep relationships growing and flourishing. We see this over and over again in the scientific literature, that when people express fondness and admiration, that helps relationships grow. And confrontations and conflicts are threats to the relationship. Um, we know that gratitude also helps us optimize the way our brains function so we can bring the best of ourselves to our relationships. If we think back to, just go back for a moment to this feeling flower. If we think about gratitude being one of the feelings associated with that core feeling of being at peace or being peaceful, some researchers have looked into the state of mind that they refer to as flow. When people get so involved and excited about their work, they just get into this flow state and can accomplish so much. And part of that comes from this calm, relaxed sense of focus and alignment, and what Dr. Martin Seligman calls being aligned with our signature strengths, doing things that are part of our set of strengths. And that leads to an authentic sense of happiness and purpose. Um, so gratitude is really helpful for us psychologically, good for our brains, good for our state of mind, our mood. There's so many benefits associated with gratitude. So what is gratitude? It comes from the Latin root word gratia, which means grace. So I love that word, grace. And there's many variants: grace, thankfulness, awe, and wonder. And I mentioned Martin Seligman. He is a psychological researcher who's often been called the father of positive psychology, and was a president of the American Psychological Association for some time. And his research looks at gratitude as a signature strength. So he basically says there's this idea that, and he writes about this in one of his books that I like, called Authentic Happiness. And he talks about there's an assessment you can take to identify what your signature strengths are. And then if you work in a capacity where you're able to use your signature strengths, then you tend to have more authentic happiness and joy in your life. And he includes gratitude as a signature strength, that some people just naturally tend to have this well of gratitude and appreciation and wonder, and they bring that to their work and they express that appreciation. And that's a strength. And so when they're working in capacities that they're able to sort of express this part of themselves, they're more likely to experience happiness and joy. But Mr. Rogers understood the impact and value of gratitude intuitively, and appreciation was his constant companion. He was always looking at the world with this awe and wonder, looking at his neighbors. We even saw, I love the clip that David showed, where Mr. Rogers met with Jeffrey Erlinger. And at one point in that program, he asked Jeffrey about what made him have to have the real wheelchair. And in one of their conversations, Jeffrey said that he had autonomic dysreflexia. And Mr. Rogers, you could see, was just so proud of him for knowing how to pronounce those words. And he said, "Well, boy, you sure do know how to say it." You know, he was
That's,
always just looking for the good in others. And I like to say he inhaled wonder and exhaled appreciation, and we can't.
mhm.
That was just his way of taking things in, just with this sense of awe and wonder of, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. And he would observe that and take that in, and then he would express it. And some of the research on gratitude shows that when you are a person of gratitude that expresses that gratitude and appreciation, your peers tend to see you as a more pleasant person. They tend to rate you higher in pro-social behavior and be more likely to want to connect with you. Um, so let's think about Mr. Rogers' daily display of wondrous appreciation. He just looked for the gifts each day, to appreciate and admire. And he did this in his television program. He began by singing about this concept. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. It's a beautiful day for a neighbor. And yet it wasn't really dependent on circumstances like the weather. You might be thinking, oh, well, it's kind of cold where I am, or it's the beginning of spring, but I'm not really seeing the flowers yet, or maybe it's a gloomy or rainy day. But one of the things he said was, it doesn't matter what the weather's like outside, we can make it a beautiful day inside. And so that just kind of speaks to his spirit of gratitude and his perspective. Um, and he often expressed that as fondness and appreciation. Uh, for example, I'll go back to that example that we saw with him meeting with this young man, Jeffrey Erlinger. And by the way, one of the things that makes that so special, you might have noticed on Dave's screen, on the side, there was another video queued up that showed Mr. Rogers in a tuxedo with the young man in a wheelchair in a tuxedo as well. And that was Jeffrey Erlinger many years later, that surprised Mr. Rogers and showed up when he won a television award, and said he was there on behalf of all children to let him know that when he says it's you I like, that they understand that he really does mean that. Um, so, and of course, that was so special to Mr. Rogers as he knelt down with Jeffrey, and we could see the bond that the two of them had and the fondness and appreciation expressed there. Sometimes we might feel gratitude though and be hesitant to express it. And that can be like this idea of maybe going out and buying someone a gift and perhaps even wrapping it or setting it aside, but forgetting to give it to them or forgetting to mail it, and it's collecting dust, and maybe we're feeling guilty because we haven't sent it out and they're wondering if we forgot their birthday, right? So it's so much better when we express that gratitude to our friends and neighbors, because that can help them and it can help us. Um, I remember I shared with you guys um, how I experienced this with my memes. You know, when I didn't have a lot of contact with my family once I went away to college. My mom had a tough conversation with me, and she said, "Well, if you move out, you'll be on your own, and we will not help you again. So you'll be on your own." And that was kind of a challenging situation for me. But my memes was someone who was always supportive. She would, I worked my way through college as a server, and she would send me checks here and there. She was on a fixed income, but maybe $100 check here or there. And that was quite a lot for her. And it was a huge blessing to me as well. And even though she had gone through so much loss, and when I went to visit her, see, we grew up in a Cuban Italian family, and her father owned a vegetable store. So she grew up working at the vegetable store. So when I'd go see her, we go to Walmart and we would go to Sam's Club and like three different grocery stores to look at vegetables. And she wanted to inspect them all and get the best ones at the best price. Not to mention the fact we probably spent more on gas than we saved on these veggies. But that was what she did. So she was very, very thrifty, very frugal, and yeah, so supportive. So that gift was just a sacrificial gift of love to me. And I would often send her thank you notes and express it, but I didn't know if it ever really conveyed just how much it meant to me that I had her in my life and that she was so supportive and loving, until one day, when one of the textbooks that I was helped co-author, I was able to write a dedication to her in the book. And when I gave it to her, went to see her at the retirement home where she was staying, and as she was, moving on her walker, she just stopped and she started to weep, and she just said, "Oh, honey, this is really something." That was one of her phrases. "This is really something else." You knew that was special when she said that, because she wasn't usually at a loss for words. She was a Spanish instructor. So just to see her cry and to see how much it moved her to be able to express that appreciation to her, especially now that she's in heaven, I'm so thankful for that memory. So I just encourage others, if you can, to express
Mm.
that appreciation while you can, because it's a gift. It's a gift that will bless you and the receivers of that appreciation. And for Mr. Rogers, it was much more than a thank you. It was really his way of looking at the world, and he had eyes to see what was good in his neighbor. He searched for that. And he searched for that in his environment with these. It was almost like he could put on lenses of awe and wonder. And just look, I remember in one episode, he went into a kindergarten classroom and he was trying to prepare children to start school. It was near the fall or the autumn. And he went in and said, "Wow, there's just so much to see here." And he tried to imagine what it would be like as a child walking into this new environment. Um, and we already talked about the example with Jeffrey talking about autonomic dysreflexia, saying, "Boy, you really can say that, can't you?" Just that awe and wonder and appreciation. And in a world where we might be both loved and wounded by the people that are closest to us, the healing balm of gratitude is
Mm.
essential. If we can be able to express gratitude, it really does help those relationships to prosper and to continue to grow. So a couple things to remember here are uh, working on mastering marveling and awe and wonderment are good first steps towards a life of gratitude. It's helpful to cultivate eyes to see what's good in our neighbors and our environments. We tend to find what we're looking for. So when we're feeling blue, we might be looking through some blue lenses, so to speak, and finding all those negative things that might be bringing us down. But if we kind of change those lenses and look for the good, we tend to find what we're looking for. And grateful people tend to have better relationships. And there are many elements of gratitude, grace, thankfulness, appreciation, awe, wonder fondness and admiration. So we can express that gratitude in a number of different ways. So we talked about empathy, we talked about gratitude. Let's go over one more of the 7 secrets. And the quote that I think of when I think of this secret is one from Mr. Rogers, where he said, "Love is at the root of everything, all learning, all parenting, all relationships, love or the lack thereof it." And that's a pretty powerful quote because Mr. Rogers wasn't really known for using a lot of absolutist statements or really strong language. Actually, some of his colleagues joked around that he spoke Fredish because he would keep massaging and working with language and helping them to say things in more therapeutic ways. And so it often was less direct. So for example, instead of saying you should do your homework, it might be something more like, it's good to do your homework, and adults will help you. The adults with you will help you know what to focus on, because not everybody had parents. So he didn't want to use the term parent. So he spoke with a great deal of sensitivity. But this was a pretty strong statement here that love is at the root of everything. And the science of attachment has been termed the scientific study of love. And attachment theory is a developmental theory that Mr. Rogers understood well due to his background in developmental psychology. And so the last secret in the Mr. Rogers effect is establishing security. He had an incredible ability to help children feel more secure through the screen long before Zoom was a mainstay. And he was trained by Dr. Margaret McFarland at the University of Pittsburgh, and she worked with Eric Erickson, who if some of you guys ever took psych courses or maybe human growth and development courses, you probably learned about Eric Erickson's stages of human growth and development. He had all these psychosocial stages. And he worked together with Dr. Margaret McFarland, and McFarland wound up being Mr. Rogers' supervisor when he was doing his counseling courses. And they hit it off so well that he invited her to consult with him for the rest of his career. And he continued meeting with her on a weekly basis. He took copious notes, and he tried to apply all that he was learning to his programming to make it more therapeutic for kids. And in the American Counseling Association refers to him as America's children's television therapist, because he was so therapeutic in what he shared. Nothing was accidental. He was very intentional about what he shared. And so he really promoted this security throughout his programming. So you might be, if you're not as familiar with that lingo, you might be wondering, well, really, what do you mean by security, or what is attachment security? So in my most recent book, it's called The 4 Relationship Styles, which are the 4 attachment styles. I recast those in a user-friendly way as professions, because just like our professions help us meet our financial needs and our needs to have meaning and purpose and make a difference in the world, our relationship styles help us to meet our psychological needs, our emotional needs, and our relational needs. And John Bowlby, who's known as the father of attachment theory, said these attachment styles are active from the cradle to the grave, or as John Kuhnley likes to say, from the womb to the tomb. And, depending on the type of environment you grew up with, you developed a style of an attachment style or relationship style that helped you thrive or survive in that environment. And so let's take a look at the 4 different styles that develop. The first style, called the firefighter style. Those with the firefighter style tend to have walked through the fires of either loss or abuse. And in the academic literature, this is sometimes called the fearful avoidance style, or the unresolved for loss or unresolved for abuse style. But I prefer to describe each style based on the strengths that the individual has developed throughout their journey, rather than the symptomology or weakness or challenges. The next style is the investigator. Investigators are keen observers. They only had one consistent thing in their background, and that was inconsistency. They tended to not know what to expect from their caretakers or their romantic relationships. So they developed these really keen observational skills to scan their environment and look for what to expect. They become keen observers, and have a great capacity to read other people's emotions and feelings, but sometimes could be asleep to their own. Um, Investigators tend to have a bit higher level of anxiety, but they do value relationships highly. Then there's the security guard. And if you imagine a security guard guarding the perimeter of an estate saying, step back, don't trespass. Security guards tend to highly value, relational security guards tend to highly value their boundaries and their independence. They keep others at arm's length. Um, and one thing I should mention is the same way that we deal with relationships is a similar way that we deal with emotions. So the security guards in some ways have the opposite stance of the investigator. The investigator tends to move towards connection and hyperactivate, put more energy into their relationships, and can sometimes get overwhelmed or flooded with the emotion. The security guard has the opposite strategy. They deactivate, they minimize emotion, they move away from emotion, shut down connection. Um, and one other thing that's important to remember about relationship styles that makes them different from the Enneagram or your personality type or your Myers-Briggs or your love language is that the relationship styles or attachment styles are part of the attachment behavioral system. So they're specifically activated when people are under stress. And so what each style needs when they're under stress is a little different. The security guard needs some space to process their feelings and be by themselves, where the investigator might need or want more reassurance and comfort that other people care. They might be the person that says, hey, why didn't you follow me after that argument? Why didn't you follow up with me and say, hey, are you okay? Whereas the security guard says, well, why didn't you give me more space there? And then the networker, they tend to be master connectors. They love to share with others and hear from others. They love to connect with people, and they like to explore, and they also are very at home with their own emotions and the emotions of others. They can talk about positive emotion without exaggerating them. And I don't like to use the term negative emotions because every emotion tells us something important, but unpleasant or painful emotions, they can also talk about without having to diminish them. So they tend to be highly emotionally intelligent, very low in anxiety and low in avoidance. During times of stress, they tend to move toward connection, and they can be easily comforted. The good news is you're not stuck with the style and level of functioning you have. You can become more secure. And Mr. Rogers was a pro at helping people become more secure. And one of the reasons is because when he was growing up, he was bullied as a child. He struggled with his weight a little bit early on, and he was bullied for his outward appearance. And he had some bullies chasing him home. He was running home. They were calling him names. And he took refuge in a neighbor's house. He ran to a neighbor's house. Um, and I believe that that may be one of the days that little Fred Rogers of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, became the Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Because later on, when he saw people throwing pies in each other's faces on television, he thought that was demeaning behavior. And he knew personally how painful it was to experience demeaning behavior. And he wanted to get involved in television to see it be used for good rather than to demean one person. And his grandpa McFeely, who he was named after, Fred McFeely, told him a healing message. And his grandpa said to him, Freddie, you've made this day a special day just by your being you. There's no one else in the whole world like you. And I like you just the way you are. And then he took that message and he paid it forward on television for many years to come. Um, and, you know, I experienced some bullying growing up too, and my memes gave me a similar healing message, so I could really relate. She was a woman of faith, and so she gave me some verses to remember. She told me, you know, if anyone bullies you or hurts you, bless them. Don't persecute them. Don't curse them. Don't get down to their level. Just bless them. And she highlighted some scriptures in my Bible. One of them was, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse them. And another was, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it's written, it's mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. And she really helped me to think of God as my heavenly Father, and to be able to say to myself, hey, my dad is God of the universe. So if you mess with me, bless you, because you'll have to answer to him one day. And even though that was just my internal dialogue, it helped me to cope in those times. And it helped inform my journey to become a counselor and want to help others and make a difference, just as I think Mr. Rogers' experiences helped him. So I wanted to share with you guys a technique that Mr. Rogers used every time he spoke, every time he received the television award. He would do this very brief technique, and I call it the 10-second transformation, because it helped people transform their mood and feel safe and secure. And I've also called it the invisible gift, because it's something that you can share with others. Um, so if you're comfortable doing this, please join, and I'll just adapt it to our setting to close with this. And he would say, and you've made this day a special day just by your being you. There's no one else in the world like you. I like you just the way you are. And he would say, you guys are here today to make a difference in your neighborhoods, to keep this neighborly sentiment going forward, to express neighborly care. And chances are you didn't get to this point on your own. Chances are there are people along your journey that loved you into being, that loved you into becoming who you are today. They loved and nurtured the best in you. So let's take a moment to think of someone who loved you into being who you are today. Let's take 10 seconds. I'll keep the time. Thank you. Thank you for taking a moment to think about those individuals, and imagine how happy they would be to know that in this moment, reflecting on who you are and the difference you're making, that you thought of them.
Mm.
And I'd love to know if anyone feels comfortable sharing in one word kind of what feelings came up for you as you thought about someone who loved you into being. And by the way, he would say, those individuals could be right here in this room. They could be far away, or they could even be in heaven.
Others may want to share in chat. If I took 10 seconds to do that every time before I publicly spoke, I would begin every presentation with tears. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I want to use that technique, but it's great to pause and think about those
Yeah.
that have loved you and helped you.
I
So
thought about my grandmother. I know a lot of times I have a hard time with my mom. She was real strict with us. But I know my grandmother loved me. And so I say that all the time. Even though I have an uncle who's younger than me, actually. So my grandmother and my mom were actually pregnant at the same time. And I said, I don't know how she did it raising her own kids, but she showed me love too. Every time I think of her, I could just see love coming from her. So I thought about that when you think about who helped you to be who you are today. It was my grandmother.
oh, I love that, April. Yes. So special. Yeah. And sometimes when I ask people for one word, they'll say, and a lot of people do tear up too. They'll say gratitude or warmth or loved or accepted. Um, and then you can always ask yourself, how do I behave when I feel secure? And a lot of times people will say friendly, helpful, kind. And then I have a colleague who's an attachment researcher who says she keeps a quote at home and in her office that says, do what you would do if you felt secure, if you felt loved, cared for, warm. And I think that's how Mr. Rogers tried to help us feel. Does anyone have any questions or anything else you'd like to share? David, I have my website here if anybody would like to find out more information about my work.
Oh, yeah, I love that. And we continue to talk about the book, and others may have questions. You're welcome to type them in chat or to click on ask one. I do have one that I have to ask you right at the very beginning. And it's not about these 7 secrets exactly. How did you get to use the name Mr. Rogers and so much of the content? Because I know they are fiercely protective of the brand of Mr. Rogers. So how did you make that happen?
I I tried to be very careful to quote and cite throughout the book. A lot of the content that we use was actually written by others about him. For example, we quoted the foreword, things his books that his wife Joanne wrote, things that she said about him. Um, like she talked about the three top words she would use to describe him if she had to. And, for example, one of them was surprising, was discipline. There's another great book called I'm Proud of You that was about his relationship with a journalist that asked him, he had a special bond with him. And this young man asked him, Mr. Rogers, will you be proud of me? Because he had such a tough relationship with his own father. And they
Mhm.
wrote letters and had a long friendship. And he would sign all the letters, I'm proud of you. And then he started doing IP, what is it? IPOY. I'm proud of you. That was sort of their code. Um, and so a lot of the content actually comes from um, interactions he had with other people, as well as things that were written about him and his programming. I think we used a variety of so many different sources. Unfortunately, I would have loved to be able to use his picture on the book. The publishers, I guess that wasn't a possibility, but we wound up, having an image of a person in a cardigan, which was his hallmark. And
Yes.
I thought that was neat to allow people to be able to imagine themselves sort of keeping his legacy alive. The goal was to help keep his work alive. And um, so I'm thankful to have been able to write about him. And it was got to meet his son John Rogers at Rollins College. He went to Rollins College in
Mm.
Winter Park, Florida, where he studied music. That's where he met his wife Joanne. They both studied music there. She was a concert pianist. And Paul Day, a sculptor from France, created a beautiful sculpture of Mr. Rogers surrounded by children that is at Rollins College. So if you ever get a chance to go to Winter Park, Florida, um, it's I lived in Florida for a while, so it was neat to be able to check it out. But
Yeah.
beautiful sculpture there. Um,
It's one of
so
the, well,
yeah.
well, any others before? I know we've gone a little longer than we do sometimes, but several of you have hung on. So anyone else have a question they would like to ask real quickly? Um, Several have texted already. I see a few messages. Any, Jennifer? I see you're unmuting there.
I don't have a question, but I just felt like expressing my appreciation and just celebrating Mr. Rogers, who's been on my mind a lot this week. And I do think that legacy that he left is important to keep going. And because I've been reflecting, my kids don't know who he is. They're little. My brother is 20. He probably doesn't. But what he did is really bring some life-changing principles to all of us. And I just appreciate you keeping that going forward and sharing with us today. So thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Jennifer. I really appreciate that. And I just want to say, I mean, your brother and your kids are blessed to have you. And it's interesting, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood has been the next generation of television for Mr. Rogers. So, and
Yes.
a lot of his programs on PBS still, or the Fred Rogers Productions has some of them available on YouTube. Um, and a lot of the literature shows that kids that grow up watching Mr. Rogers tend to be more creative and have longer attention spans. So it's great to get them watching that. Um,
Yeah.
we had
I often joke that a lot of my parenting comes from what would Mom Tiger do. So
oh, I love that. Yeah. Yeah, we had a little one watching a clip of Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, and Daniel Tiger said, "Let's put on our binoculars and look for treasures. Imagine you're at the beach. What treasures do you see?" So she put on her little binoculars and she pointed to her mom, and then she pointed to her grandpa, and she said, "I see a treasure. You're a treasure, and you're a treasure." And I
that's
thought,
Wow. Love
"Wow,
that.
we got to have you watching more of this."
Well, Well, I think even in the intro to your book, you mentioned a comment that someone made on YouTube that we all have within us the potential to be Mr. Rogers. I find it really interesting when you look at gig websites or places where you can hire talent. You can find all sorts of impersonators for Elvis and Mark Twain and Lincoln and all these things, but you won't find Mr. Rogers impersonators. I think because it wasn't an act; it was who he was. But we all have within us the ability to be a Mr. Rogers in our neighborhood and for those around us. And I think your book helps us to be able to do that even better with learning about and understanding some of these traits and these secrets. So really appreciate your book and the lessons you've taught us through that.
Thank you so much, David. I love that. That reminded me of that scene from the Tom. I don't know if you saw the Tom Hanks movie where Tom Hanks was in the role of Mr. Rogers, and he said, "I never felt like I had to, put on a show or do anything fancy to connect with kids. I just thought I had to be myself and play the role of myself."
Yeah, yeah, love that, love that.
Yeah.
Well, we'll go ahead and conclude today. I know you have other things on your schedule. We so appreciate you giving of your time, and we'll continue to talk about your book in the months ahead. Encourage people to read that, get a copy, and appreciate you taking time to share with us. Thanks everybody for being online today.
Thank you, David, so much for having
Thank
me.
you.
Yeah, great to meet you by Zoom.
Bye.
I'll
Bye.
put my website and email in the chat in case anybody wants to get the bonuses or more information.
Yes, I'll share that out then. I'll include that on the class video that will be watched by many. Anita, thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for having me.
So
It was-
appreciate it.
Bless you guys.
Take care. Bye.